Welcome to the Wade Center's podcast.
A podcast of Wheaton College. It's an interesting genre because in the old days, you became famous and then you wrote your autobiography or your memoir because people wanted to know what your life was like, what shaped you, the famous people you met. And Chesterton is full of people from his own time. Here's what I thought of Yeats. Here's what I thought of Hilaire Belloc. It's interesting because the whole idea of memoir or autobiography has really exploded in the last 20 years because you don't wait to become famous. In the old days, you became famous and then you wrote an autobiography.
Yeah.
But now you become famous by writing your autobiography.
This is Crystal Downing, and I am joined by David Downing and Aaron Hill for our Wade Center podcast. And this week, we want to talk about autobiography because at least half of our Wade Center authors attempted or published autobiographies. Now, you may say, wait a second. You have 7 authors. How can half of them do that? By the end of this podcast, you'll understand what I mean. But to get us into this conversation about autobiography, I want to draw attention to the fact that Dorothy Sayers, in her book, The Mind of the Maker, which is a theology of creativity, actually spends a whole chapter talking about the creativity of autobiography. The trouble is... It's the shortest chapter of the whole book. It's 5.5 pages is all she could say about it. But here is how she ends. And we'll use this to start our conversation about the very genre of autobiography. She says, the writing of autobiography is a dangerous business. It is a mark either of great insensitiveness to danger or of an almost supernatural courage. So let's talk about that. Why is autobiography dangerous business?
I wanted to say genre is G-E-N-R-E, a species of literary writing. I had a student once, she said the chandra of writing. She thought it was a proper name. So this is a genre. Autobiography, I think it's dangerous because Henry James, the novelist, said that he didn't like first-person fiction because it led one into a fluidity of self-revelation. You reveal more about yourself than you realize. And I think the danger is you think you're talking about X, but actually you're talking about Y. Lewis talked about Surprised by Joy. Ding, that's number 1 of our 7 authors.
Okay.
You only have to get to 3.5.
Oh, do I need to play a ding noise every time you mention it in the first? Okay, all right.
And, well, since the Wade Center was started with a collection of materials by and about C.S. Lewis, and then the other authors were added, we probably should start with Lewis's autobiography, and maybe this might illustrate what we're talking about in terms of the dangers. So, David, why don't you talk about Lewis's autobiography? First of all, what ignited his desire to write it, and what is distinctive about it?
Well, he was invited to write it. It's called Surprised by Joy, written in 1955, which interestingly is the same time he was writing the Narnia Chronicles, or working on them. The title comes from a sonnet by Wordsworth, Surprised by Joy. A Wordsworth sonnet is about, after a grieving experience, he assumes he'll never be happy again. And he suddenly catches himself going, wait a minute, there's joy, there's happiness, there's moments of jubilation, even after this horrible experience of bereavement.
Wow.
But Lewis uses it to mean surprised by joy in his special term, joy meaning sin-sooked or sweet desire, the longing for the unattainable, which is both painful but also pleasurable. And he makes that the narrative structure of the whole autobiography the same way that he made it the skeleton or the spine of Pilgrim's Regress. Now, Lewis, though, he says at the beginning, I've been asked to explain how I passed from atheism to Christianity. So he thinks he's doing spiritual autobiography.
And wait a second, who asked him?
Yeah, that's what I want to know. Who asked him?
His friend Harv.
Say that.
I don't know. The publishers asked him.
Okay.
Harkat Brace-Jovanovich, so I assume the publishers asked him.
Okay. Well, the reason I ask is because I know that there was an earlier attempt at autobiography.
Yes, was.
And I suspect that nobody asked him to write that one. And we previously talked about a sort of allegorical autobiography that he wrote in Pilgrim's Regress.
It's true.
So it feels like he tried to do this several times. So that makes me suspicious that somebody asked him. That's just me.
Well, I think that's very true. Spiritual autobiography usually means, here's my journey, here's how I found God, here's how I found fulfillment, and maybe you can follow the same path and find fulfillment as well, or find meaning in life. So he wrote what they now call the early prose joy when he became a theist in 1930, which is, I had no meaning in life. I had a feeling that there was nothing behind the universe. It was just this random collection of galaxies and atoms. And suddenly he was excited about the fact that he was a theist. He wasn't even a Christian yet. So he wrote this early version, which reflects very clearly on Pilgrim's Progress. 1955, he's getting toward the end of his life. He's written most of his important books. He's going to die in 1963. And so it's really not an autobiography in the usual sense. Auto meaning self, bio meaning life, and graph meaning writing. So some people, like Chesterton, wrote very clearly near the end of his life, he wrote an autobiography, which is My Life and Times. Here's where I went to school. Here's the famous people I knew. Here's what I thought of them. Lewis is much more what they call a memoir, which is my most significant memories. And Lewis is very, he calls it the shape of my early life. Lewis once said, even if people live to be 1,000, the first 20 years of their life will be the most interesting part. And I wouldn't say that myself.
Yeah, see, I don't necessarily agree with that. I think it's the most influential part of your life, maybe. Like it stands out to you because it was so significant in your memory, but I don't know if it's the most influential.
Well, I would start if I was going to write an autobiography, I would start in college. I felt like my life was very generic. I had a happy childhood. I had a lot of siblings. I went to high school. There's my picture in the high school yearbook. But when I got to college, I said...
wow, you got your picture in a yearbook.
Yeah, that would be the whole first
unusual.
chapter, the story of the picture.
Yeah.
Well, I got to college, it was like, who am I? What am I good at?
Yeah.
What do I want to do with my life? What's the meaning of my life? Do I really share my parents' faith? But up until then, I was kind of a generic kid. But Lewis was not so. He lost his mother.
Yeah.
He got sent off to boarding school, which he hated. We've talked about that in other podcasts. He fought in World War I. And so in many ways, he published his first volume of poems at the age of 19.
Yeah.
So his first 20 years were very eventful.
So here's an issue I have with autobiography, though, in general. Maybe you could comment on this related to Lewis, which is you tend to highlight certain events. You almost need drama or trauma in your life in order to make an autobiography interesting, which is why you would think like, well, why would I talk about my childhood? Because it was very normal. But a whole generation of men went to boarding school and then fought in World War I. And so it wasn't like it was that unique. I mean, because Tolkien also fought in World War I. Barfield fought in World War I. It's just that, for some reason you select out these moments in your life and say that these are significant. So there's there's a level of narcissism or grandiosity I think that you almost need to, I struggle with that about feeling like, because I think, that things that happen in my own life are significant, but then I think, well, who would want to read about them?
Right. Well, Crystal, your earlier quote from Sayers, she said that, right? There's a danger to writing autobiography. And what was the second?
She said,
dun, 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 dun,
the writing of autobiography is a dangerous business. It's a mark either of great insensitiveness to danger or of an almost supernatural courage. And I think you're talking, Aaron is talking about the supernatural courage. Like, look at how important I am. Now, all of our Wade authors were important. They were well published. And I have to admit, it is annoying that occasionally David and I would get college students who say, well, I'm starting my autobiography. And they're like 19 years old. Kind of like, what have you done to merit this? So that idea, the courage of, and I don't even think Sayers would say that's courageous. That's just narcissistic.
Maybe naive.
But what you picked up on is this issue of what do you include and what do you leave out.
What do you feel is significant, but somebody else might feel something else. Somebody else might feel your childhood is significant, David.
Yeah, that's true. I don't think so, though.
Okay. But people, when they read Surprised by Joy, there's stuff that they wish that Lewis elaborated on that he didn't feel like was significant because he's telling this very specific story of his spiritual autobiography.
Well, oddly, a lot of people criticize it because he doesn't seem to stay on task. They want my I wrote a book called Most Reluctant Convert about Lewis's spiritual journey.
Mm-hmm.
And specifically, he lost his mother. He became a materialist. He looked into occultism.
Yeah.
Then he was into philosophical idealism. Then eventually he met Tolkien and others. And several people said, I like your version of his life better than Lewis's own version of his life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
He spends a lot of time on boarding schools, and he spends a lot of time on how eccentric his father was.
Yeah.
And readers are going, now, what does this have to do with your spiritual journey?
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the danger, I think, the fluidity of self-revelation.
Yeah.
Somebody said that all autobiography contains some fiction, and all fiction contains some autobiography.
Oh, right.
Part of the reason that Lewis's memoir, I could perfectly call it a memoir, because he talks about the war in 2 paragraphs. He talks about Mrs. Moore, who he lived with as an adoptive son for 30 years, in 2 sentences.
Yeah.
Wow.
But he goes on and on about boarding schools, and he goes on and on about his father. So I'm surprised some editor didn't say, you remember the original assignment?
Yeah.
I think it's fascinating because it's such a guide to his other writings. He says, when my mother died, there were many stabs of joy, there were many moments of happiness, but it was all sea and islands. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. And you immediately go, the floating islands in Pearlander.
Uh-huh.
You're supposed to learn to live on floating islands and not
Yeah.
to seek the fixed land.
Yeah. The Voyage
So-
of Dawn Treader. I mean, there's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It becomes a great guide to his thinking. He also talks about childhood and boyhood. Childhood is a time of wonder and self-forgetfulness
Yeah.
and imagination. And boyhood is just kind of clamoring for status and fighting. And whenever you read
and
his
here-
fiction or anywhere else, childhood is always a good thing and boyhood is always a regrettable state. We see that, we're going to talk about Chesterton in a while, but Chesterton's chapter on his schooling is called How to Be a Dunce. And somebody should write an article on how Chesterton's autobiography influenced, or his writings in general, influenced Lewis's thinking.
Yes.
There's a lot of similarities.
Yes, because Chesterton used that exact same diction.
Right,
So
childhood and boyhood.
is a positive term, boyhood is a negative term.
Huh.
So
He says, I was wiser at age 6 than I was at age 16. And I think Lewis would say the exact same thing.
yeah. What is Mark Twain's famous remark about adolescence?
Oh, he says, when a boy turns 13, you should put him in a barrel and just feed him through a hole in the barrel. And when he turns 16, you should plug up the hole. He thought that was those are difficult years for boys. Yeah.
And that's relevant because Mark Twain became friends with George MacDonald, who influenced Lewis considerably. So here Lewis is thinking of his autobiography as a really spiritual autobiography, but you see your summary illustrates the danger because you're aware there is so much that has happened to me. How do I get it all in? And he just goes on and on about boarding school and his father because he knows that's shaped who he was. But if you were going to try to capture every little thing that influenced you, it would take as long to write as you had lived.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Well, Chesterton's autobiography, he wrote late in life once again. It's an interesting genre because in the old days, you became famous and then you wrote your autobiography or your memoir because people wanted to know what your life was like, what shaped you, the famous people you met.
Uh-huh.
And Chesterton is full of people from his own time. Here's what I thought of Yeats. Here's what I thought of Anthony Asquith. Here's what I thought of Hilaire Belloc. Lewis he calls the shape of the early life, and it's much more, he calls it suffocatingly subjective. It's really about his mind and where his mind was at different ages. It's interesting because the whole idea of memoir or autobiography has really exploded in the last 20 years because you don't wait to become famous. In the old days, you became famous and then you wrote an autobiography.
Yeah.
But now you become famous by writing your autobiography.
Well,
They're
it's
very
almost
clever memoirs by David Sedaris.
Yeah, it's almost though like sometimes it's like if one traumatic event happens to you in your life, that means you need to write an autobiography now.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
And it's about that thing, but you put that at the end of the story and you spend chapter after chapter building up to it.
Yeah, like you're a rock star at 18 and somebody writes your biography. You know, I think there's what's the woman, Jojo Sliwa, who is on Nickelodeon, came out as gay.
Yeah.
And so she's like 16. And there's a whole biography of her at 16.
So there's part of the danger, too, because obviously biographies and autobiographies can be very ideologically motivated.
Right.
So here we have something that we want to communicate, and a celebrity can make our message seem more legitimate. This gets back to the danger that Sayers was talking about.
Yeah, you see that in a lot of biographical adaptations for film. That's just why, in my opinion, pretty much anytime somebody tries to adapt a biography or an autobiography to a film, it just it ruins the story. Because it's like you had to do a pruning process in order to write the book. There's that self-censoring if it's an autobiography. And then somebody takes that and censors it further to turn it into a movie. And these days, every movie has to have a message. So they end up just reshaping the person's life. And you're like, that's not what their life was like at all. Like that Harriet Tubman biography movie that came out a while back, and they got criticized for leaving a bunch of stuff out and, portraying it in a different way. But it's that self-selection in autobiography. And then it's like twice removed.
Right. So the message and the ideological implication is driving your selection process.
Yeah.
Well, that's why Lewis, I think, didn't talk much about the war and didn't talk about Mrs. Moore. He didn't think they came into his spiritual journey that much. Biography goes back, probably the most famous early one was Augustine's Confessions. But his purpose was, here's how my life went, and let me be an exemplar, because let's skip Manichaeism, let's skip this and that.
Yeah.
So they're writing with kind of a didactic purpose, which is to use their own lives as a template. It's for the reader to measure his or her life.
Surprised by Joy reminds me a lot of Augustine's Confessions. There's a lot of discussion about early life and sins of boyhood and those kinds of things.
Right.
And has the same point about how I transitioned from someone cynical towards Christianity towards a earnest follower of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about Augustine, and of course he wrote his around 400 AD, and he, first of all, you consider his narrative structure. He doesn't call it an autobiography. It's called the Confessions.
Yeah.
And he writes it to God.
Yeah.
This is my story to you, God, and you were very aware of this process.
Yeah.
But he also says, quote, when we describe the past, it is not the reality of it we are drawing out of our memories, but only words based on impressions of moments that no longer exist. And that is the other danger, because especially if you have this message or ideology you're trying to promote, you're going to elevate as more important certain incidents and suppress others.
Yeah.
And life is much more complicated.
Yeah.
But life is so complicated, how can you possibly include everything? But also, what the point Augustine is making is that our memories aren't that accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, all of us have had that experience where you're talking to family members and you say, oh, remember the time that Daddy fell asleep and I put a rock down his nose? And your sibling says, no, that was me that put the rock down his nose. And somebody else says, no, that was his brother or uncle who was sleeping. And within your own family, you'll get disagreements about memory. We do not have always immediate access to memories.
Yeah, so I think I want to ask for all the listeners now, did you put a rock down somebody's nose, Crystal?
I thought that was a weird example.
Very random
I don't know
example.
why that.
Okay, listeners, don't put rocks down people's noses.
Well, it's also interesting when you meet people, though, what is a defining moment for them versus sometimes I'll see students at a reunion or a homecoming, and this one student said, I remember this time, this was at Westmont out in Santa Barbara, somebody gave me a pencil that said, train up a young man in the way he shall go and he will not depart from it. It was like printed on the pencil in gold lettering. And she came to see me and she said, what's that pencil? I said, I don't know, somebody gave it to me. I say, yeah, I often use it in my own devotionals, this pencil. And she said, I remember how this time you had this pencil with a verse on it. And you said you used it in your own devotionals. And I was kind of going, A, I don't remember that conversation. And B, I don't remember you. But for her, for some reason, that conversation stuck in her mind.
I've had those experiences in ministry, serving as a youth pastor. You get that a lot. You have youth students, and they will remember something that happened or something you said in a message, and you see them 10 years later, and they're like, "That changed my life," and I'm like, "I don't even remember talking about that." And so to me, that's the interesting thing is where you pick something out. That to me, that's where it's good in some cases to have like a biography versus an autobiography, like reading Most Reluctant Convert that you wrote, David, versus Surprised by Joy. I think reading those together can really help you get a better picture, because sometimes we don't have a good assessment of what is most important in our own lives, I think.
Right.
It just happens to be, well, I want to talk about a certain topic, and then you pick out the things that you think are most important to that. But sometimes even your spouse or a loved one that knows you very well might say, "Oh, well, but what about this thing that happened?"
Right.
And so our inability to know our own selves, to me, kind of hamstrings autobiography, I think.
Yeah, I agree. We just had our pastor last week said that of managers or leaders who are in the bottom quartile, the bottom 25%, in terms of their organization saying, "Are you a good listener?"
Mm-hmm.
They're literally rated at the bottom. They themselves, 94% say, "I'm a good listener" or "an excellent listener."
Mm-hmm.
So people's self-perception can really skew their sense of how they tell their life story versus how other people would tell it.
I think it can work in the case of some authors, because what makes them a good author is their ability. They have a good high emotional intelligence and an ability to understand how other people think. The challenge is, can they then apply that to themselves? I think Lewis is very incisive about psychology, and you see that in all of his novels. And so I think that's where his autobiography works really well. But sometimes it doesn't work because that ability to apply that insight to other people doesn't direct back inwards,
Yeah, I agree. Well, there's a whole genre of victimization autobiography, which this happened to me and this happened. And you wonder if you just selected all these episodes and made that into your life story.
Yeah.
We're all very selective about our personal narratives.
Yeah.
So we should get back to our authors. What about Dorothy Sayers? Why did she start writing an autobiography, and why didn't she publish it?
Well, this conversation leads up to answer that question, because Sayers was so aware of all these difficulties that we're discussing that after having written 9 best-selling novels, she decided to write a autobiography in 1932, and she called it My Edwardian Childhood.
Oh, wow.
And she actually starts with an interesting line. She says, "I am a citizen of no mean city." So she borrows that Bible verse that Paul uses when he's been captured in Jerusalem. And then she talks about being born in Oxford, and then goes into her earliest memory. And, that's a conversation many people have. What was your earliest memory?
Right.
Yeah.
And David and I had a friend back in California who said he cannot remember anything earlier than 5th grade.
Wow.
But Sayers goes into her earliest memory that she had a temper tantrum and was just yelling on the floor while her nurse was trying to get her dressed and go out for a walk or something. But after writing 36 handwritten pages, she gave up on it in a month because she was getting so bogged down in details.
Oh.
And she started describing the knickknacks in her parents' house.
Oh, wow.
She kept saying, multiple times she said, "I wonder what a psychoanalyst would think of this. What would Freudians say about this?" She's very aware that her choices reveal something that she may not even be in control of.
Oh, wow.
And so it wasn't until 2 years later that she started over, but this time she decided to make it a fiction. So she invented a pseudonym and a character named Catherine Lamas, but she used much of the exact same incidents that she had written about in her acknowledged My Edwardian Childhood.
Interesting.
And so it's almost like she recognizes any autobiography is a fictional construction.
Yeah.
It's constructed about memories, but as Augustine acknowledges, as we are all acknowledging, we do not have pure access to our memories of the past, and how much have our memories been manipulated by what happened later on.
Yeah. Wow.
So I had a scenario when
Is
David
this going to have a rock on her nose? Is that going to come up?
No.
Okay.
But when we went to my first 10-year reunion, and I had developed a narrative of my life that I was a airbrain, dumb blonde in high school, and it wasn't until college and really grad school that I started using my brain. So it was this narrative of transformation.
Gotcha.
So we go to my 10-year high school reunion, and people came up to me and said, "Oh, Crystal, she was always the smartest one in the class." And David looked at me and he said, "I thought you said you were this airbrain in high school." But I actually believed I was.
Huh.
So others perceived me differently than I did.
Yeah.
And this gets to the whole issue of narrative.
Yeah.
If you want your narrative to build, and it is a literary form,
Mm-hmm.
so if you want the narrative to be something that people enjoy reading, you're leading to a transformational moment.
Yeah.
And that gets us back to C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy. You wonder what he was thinking about, why he needed to spend so much time on boarding school and his father in order to explain his transformation into a Christian.
Huh.
Well, I think he was doing some self-therapy there, because he did have a thesis, which was, I had these experiences of joy. My brother had this toy garden. He took some moss and some twigs and put them in a biscuit tin, and it looked like nature. And I had this feeling of pleasure. It's interesting because Chesterton, one of his earliest memories is a young man who's debonair with a mustache, who's crossing a bridge and holding a golden key. And he's looking up at a beautiful woman in a window. And he says, "I should probably tell you at some point, this was a toy theater my father made." But he says, the first time I experienced pleasure was through art. I really saw the mountains in the background were so dramatic. And then Lewis, one of his earliest experiences of joy is the art of his brother making a toy garden in a biscuit tin.
Huh.
And I wonder if Lewis remembered that for Chesterton, this aesthetic experience in childhood was a work of art.
Right.
And he himself remembered his brother's work of art.
So what you read by others is going to influence your selectivity of important incidents.
Yeah.
Well, there's a good book by Daniel McAdams, a psychiatrist at Harvard, called Narrating Our Own Lives.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, most of your memories from childhood, they're either positive because your sense of self or accomplishment or self-expression was validated, like I won a contest, I wrote a poem, or else it's denied. He says the two primal things are individuating yourself from the masses.
Gotcha.
But the other one is community, family, belonging. And he says most positive memories, either something happened to individuate you or else something happened that was a good moment of connection, like
sticking a rock up somebody's nose.
Exactly. She accepted my invitation to the prom, or blah blah blah, or my mother was pleased with this. But most negative memories are either you applied for the scholarship and didn't get it, or you asked someone to the prom and didn't get it. I don't know where the rock comes into it. But interestingly for Lewis, he was incredibly accomplished. By the time he wrote Surprised by Joy, you would think, and a lot of people do, well, I went at 3 first at Oxford, and then I got my first book published when I was 19, and I got had some war experiences. But when you read Surprised by Joy, most of the big moments are family, community connection.
Gotcha.
It's like the way I survived, my brother and I survived my mother's death together.
Yeah.
2 orphans in the world.
You realize how important his brother is to them.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And I was at this boarding school I really hated, but I found a few friends and we would talk about literature. And over again, Lewis's memories have to do with connecting with other people. They don't have to do with individual accomplishment.
Hence the importance of the Inklings for him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Crystal, so whatever happened with these autobiographical stories, even the fictional one of Sayers?
She gave up the fictional, it was called Cat O'Mary, after 245 handwritten memories.
Yikes.
pages. And what was interesting about that is that positive images of childhood that were in the first fragment, she starts being very negative in the second.
Oh.
And it's fascinating. You can go to the Wade and actually see as she is struggling through it. She's putting autobiographical material into a fiction, but there's all these cross-outs, and it's like she's just trying to get it right. So even though it's ostensibly a fiction, she's still aware that she wants to be true to the fiction, and she knows that not everything in childhood was positive and delightful, but then she gets excessively negative in the Catamary. Now, what's interesting is after frustration with both of these attempts is she ended up writing her two best novels.
Oh.
Isn't that interesting?
Huh.
So she gave up writing my Edwardian Childhood autobiography and wrote The Nine Tailors, which some people consider her most artistic novel. In fact, Charles Williams loved it so much, and he's another author at the Wade, that he was the one who recommended she write a play for Canterbury Festival. Then when she went back and started this fictionalization of the exact same material, although she starts pushing it in a different direction and getting old and being married to someone who cheats on her. I mean, it's not a pleasant read, and that's fiction. But then she gave that up and wrote Gaudy Night, which many people would say is her best novel.
And it's kind of autobiographical.
I was going to say it's got a little bit of
because it's about
factory
being at Oxford University,
going back to the school,
right?
Seeing
in
how
fact,
other women fared compared to how she fared.
Yeah,
right?
We did a podcast about it, so people could go back and listen to that podcast. So isn't that brilliant? Talk about what would a psychoanalyst do about that.
It's a certain level of personal insight that then enables you to turn back around and produce good work. So even if you don't publish it, it might be a worthwhile thing to do.
Well, Chesterton said, I'd never heard this before. He wrote a biography of Dickens.
Oh, right.
And he said that Dickens tried to write an autobiography and it wasn't going well, but some of it got word for word into David Copperfield.
Oh,
he decided to turn it into fiction.
Yes.
And there's a certain freedom to say, I don't have to back up every fact with a memory or documentation. And so Chesterton himself, it's once again that principle of selectivity. In his autobiography, he remembers he had an old puritanical grandfather, and people were saying, well, how could God create someone they're predestined to go to hell, and that's not fair. And his grandfather said, I would thank God for creating me even if I were a lost soul. And I'm sure that Chesterton remembered that because he himself had this tremendous feeling of gratitude for existence.
Yeah.
He said in the back of our minds, we all have this burning astonishment at the very fact we're here.
Yeah.
And the purpose of art or spirituality is to investigate that, what he calls the sunrise of wonder. But I'm sure of all his memories from childhood, he remembered what his grandfather said because it fit into his own scenario, which is, let's all be grateful for the most ordinary elemental things that we have in life.
It helped shape his worldview and his philosophy in a way that he didn't realize until maybe later in life, so it ends up sticking with you.
I agree.
The pencil example that you mentioned, clearly that influenced somebody else in a way that it didn't to you,
Yeah, I hope she doesn't go around looking at pencils for devotional insight. Allied transmission. Well, that's not really speaking to me.
Well, let's talk about some of the other authors that wrote autobiographies.
Okay. What I like about the beginning of Chesterton's autobiography is he also problematizes the very genre.
Oh, really?
Insofar as he talks about the fact that he has no evidence that he was born at a certain time or certain place because he can't remember it. He's just relying on the authority of his parents to tell him that.
Yeah, this is true.
But he takes seriously the authority. Okay, here's how he writes it. Bowing down in blind credulity, as is my custom, before mere authority and the tradition of the elders, superstitiously swallowing a story I could not test at the time by experiment of private judgment, I am firmly of opinion that I was born on the 29th of May, 1874, on Camden Hill, Kensington. And what is clever about that, And of course, Chesterton often is clever just because he enjoys being clever and surprising people and turning things on their head. But it is an essential component of his conversion to Christianity and then to Roman Catholicism, insofar as that faith depends on relying on the authority of people who are reporting this is what happened.
Yeah.
And so he would say there's all these skeptics and pessimists in the world who say, oh, no, I only rely on empirical data, but they're always relying on the authority of people who went before them, who are telling them this is the way things happened.
Yeah.
And that's what Christians do. We rely on the authority of the gospel writers as witnesses of what happened in the first century with this man named Jesus.
I think he's making fun of higher criticism there. The idea that, he's taking on authority. Later on in his autobiography, he says that when he wrote Man Who Was Thursday, it's very murky what's going on. All of these characters are actually federal agents trying to...
Well, don't give away the plot of the story. It's a very good story. Go read The Man Who Was Thursday, everybody.
Well, at the end, there's a Bible verse. And he claims that critics who read it would say, oh, well, Chesterton never wrote that ending. Some Christian cleric who was copying it added the Bible verse.
Gotcha.
So he uses his autobiography to take shots at higher criticism and that general genre of not believing that the author actually wrote it.
But that is a interesting side of autobiography, are the things that just that are just handed to us. He talks about that in an article he wrote, and he's talking about his birthday, and he's talking to George Bernard Shaw, and who is famous for not wanting to celebrate his birthday. And he talks about there's this whole side of life which consists of things that have been given to us or handed to us or that have happened to us that we have no control over. And so he's like, if it was up to me, my parents my dad would have been a dentist, and I would have been born here, and I would have been born on this day. And he's trying to make the point that like there is a whole host of things in our lives that we have absolutely no control over. But we modern people focus on the things I've done, that I've accomplished, that I've created. But he's saying that's only half of life. There's a whole other side of life. And so he talks about that in that article. But I feel like that's a big theme for Chesterton, which is a thing that can get overlooked in autobiography, is as opposed to, here's all the great accomplishments I've done in my life, saying, here's all the things that have happened to me and how they shaped me. And I didn't really have control over most of these things at all. Like I didn't pick the high school that I went to, and I didn't pick Lewis didn't get to pick the boarding school that he went to. And you know what I mean? All these things were outside of our control.
Well, there's an old adage that people who are happy with their lives and contented and feel successful, they tend to stress free will. I made all the right choices. And people who are discontented and feeling like failures, they really stress fortune or fate or God's sovereignty. It's like it wasn't meant to be, no matter what I did.
Other people who messed your life up.
Or victimology, definitely.
Yeah. So who else wrote autobiographies besides?
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Chesterton first, because he published his autobiography in 1936, which is the year he died, so very towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
He was accomplished. He wrote his autobiography after he died. I mean, how many people can do that?
And a lot of the incidents in his autobiography, he had already written about in a book published in 1909 called Tremendous Trifles.
Yeah.
And basically, they're little snippets that had been published, many of them in the Daily News, where he'll describe something that happened to him and then use it as a type of parable or metaphor for things he saw happening in culture.
Gotcha.
And so it just becomes a vivid description that is illuminating a philosophical or political principle. But then he does pretty much the same thing in his autobiography, right? Where he'll talk about something that happened to him and then relate it to the problematics of H.G. Wells' view of reality or a particular political leader.
Well, there's a lot of great lines about Bernard Shaw, the Irish dramatist who had a lot of philosophical opinions. He says, he's somewhat like the Venus de Milo. What there is impressive. But it's a great one-liner.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
He wrote that article that I mentioned in 1935 in his weekly thing, and it was on the occasion of his birthday. So he's talking about his own birthday to then talk about this philosophical thing. It's a common thing that Chesterton did.
Well, I always wonder how much Lewis, I know he read Chesterton because he mentions in Surprised by Joy and other places, but there's an incident in Chesterton's talking about his father. He loved his father. Often I see people of faith, they really love their parents and they really want to honor their parents' faith. He says, interestingly, that he grew up in a atmosphere of agnosticism after Huxley and Darwin and all that. He said, my parents were the only believers that I knew, and they were Unitarians, but they believed in a personal God.
Yeah.
We always think in the old days, everybody were good old-fashioned Christians, and now we have all the skepticism. But he's saying in the late 19th century, almost no one he knew was a Christian. He said none of the schoolmasters were Christians. They were all agnostics. But he has a wonderful paragraph on his father, who he really deeply loved. He's the one who made the toy theater. And he said, he sold houses for a living, but in his own house, he made a life. He had all kinds of hobbies. He made toy theaters. He was very, just generally into creativity and doing things. And he says of his father, as in most important things in life, the inside is much bigger than the outside.
Whoa.
And as soon as I read that, I go, did Lewis remember that line?
Yeah.
We know that's so important in Narnia.
We talked about that in the last battle episode.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I wonder how many motifs he picked up from reading Chesterton in a totally different context. That's the way reading is. You pick it up in the context of his father. And
you get that with Chesterton and MacDonald. Whenever you read them, you'll come across something and go, oh, Lewis is definitely picking up on this. Yeah.
Well, and Dorothy Sayers acknowledges that Chesterton has shaped her thinking probably more than any other writer.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think Chesterton said about MacDonald that he gave me a whole new way of looking at things, that an ordinary house can be magical and enchanted. There could be a grandmother in the attic that you don't know about. And so it's a fascinating genealogy of our Wade authors.
Yeah.
Right.
Because Chesterton always gave a lot of credit to MacDonald for his sense of the enchantment of life. But then, of course, both MacDonald and Chesterton influenced Lewis and Sayers.
Yeah.
Well, we have mentioned now every single Wade author except Owen Barfield. Does Lewis refer to Barfield in Surprised by Joy since Barfield helped him become a theist?
He does. He talks about Barfield being very important in terms of the idea of chronological snobbery, that we had all these benighted ancestors who didn't understand things, but we are so clear and insightful. And he says that, and also Barfield, I think, was influential in this idea that in the old days, things were very enchanted. Everything was supernatural. We talked about this in our last episode. And suddenly he said, there's no dryads, there's no naiads, there's no nature spirits. It's just physical processes. And then eventually that naturalism was not only external, it became internalized. I'm not in love. I just have these molecules that are aligning themselves to reproduce. And Barfield felt that the external world became disenchanted, and then the internal world of consciousness became disenchanted. And Lewis, that was very influential for him in his own idea that Christianity is a way to re-enchant the world. So he does mention Barfield. He says his first friend was Arthur Greaves, where you just agreed, like, oh, you like this? You like this? And your second friend is the adversarial friend who goes, really? That's not the way I see it. Let's talk about that. He
reads all the same books, but gets the wrong opinions or something like
exactly.
that.
Yeah. Which is funny because other people who talk about Lewis, and they say, oh, he read all the right books, but he got the wrong ideas out of them. And I go, you stole that from Lewis. I'm amazed how often Lewis's critics actually plagiarize Lewis.
Really?
And criticize him.
Really?
Yeah, he has a famous line about the Renaissance critiquing the medieval era. And he says, this is not refutation, this is sneering. And people will talk about Lewis and they'll say, this is not refutation, this is sneering. And I go, wait a minute, you're critiquing Lewis by plagiarizing Lewis? Yeah, but he did mention Barfield as an important influence.
So, but Barfield didn't write a autobiography?
Not that I know of. He wrote some autobiographical stories. We talked about, in our World War I episode, we talked about the classic example of post-traumatic stress syndrome.
Yeah.
Which he wrote a story about.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of Barfield himself in that. Barfield also wrote a story called This Ever-Diverse Pair.
Yeah.
About Barfield, the critic and thinker and poet and creative person, and Barfield, the lawyer and the money winner. And there's a character named Ramsden in that story, which is quite clearly C.S. Lewis.
Oh, really?
So he wrote autobiographical fiction.
Gotcha.
In which Lewis appears, but he didn't write a straight autobiography.
Well, I said we've mentioned every single author, but I don't think we've mentioned Tolkien. So I want to mention him now.
Oh, did he write an autobiography?
He did not.
Oh.
But people so adore Tolkien's work that they want to attribute autobiography to him. And so one critic, Tom Shippey, actually says that Tolkien's short story Leaf by Niggle is autobiographical allegory, which is about someone obsessed with just this painting perfectly this tiny leaf, and he creates this whole tree. He creates a whole new realm of nature.
Yeah.
And
I think we should do a whole episode on Leaf by Niggle.
Yeah, we
That's
should.
a great
Definitely.
story. It's
but
really
then
wonderful.
there is a short article from 1966 called Tolkien on Tolkien. But it's a newspaper article published in New York based on a statement that had been requested by one of Tolkien's publishers, where, there's the author's bio on a book. So if that's autobiography, David and I have multiple autobiographies because every book we wrote, there's a statement about the author, and they often say, oh, tell us, something real unusual, not just your degrees and your publications.
I have a golden retriever. And
Right. We love covered bridges. And so...
We like to put rocks down our nose.
I have no idea why I came up with that. I should have thought in advance for a better illustration. But then they just joined to this book blurb, basically, about the author. They quoted 3 paragraphs of one of Tolkien's letters to the person who indexed Lord of the Rings. And so if you define that as autobiography, oh my goodness, Sayers has 2,000 pages of autobiography in terms of her letters where she talks about herself and what she's thinking about and what she is doing. The same with Lewis.
Yeah.
So it's almost like people are frustrating. They love Tolkien so much. They wish he had written a full-on autobiography.
What did he select in this blurb that you... Because, when you write for Amazon, they have an Amazon author's bio, and you have to think, how do I summarize my entire life in 3 paragraphs? Obviously, it's myself as an author.
Yeah.
But it's kind of
I
a
wasn't able
challenge.
to access it, so I don't know.
Oh.
Okay.
So it makes me wonder, though, because it feels like when you write, well, we don't write letters as much anymore, but back in the day when people did write letters and you communicated that way, there's a level of autobiography in telling a story of something that happened to you to somebody else in a letter.
Right.
And even sometimes you want to try and make a point about what happened. And so I feel like we do autobiography in very small ways.
Yeah, more
bios
memoir.
for authors, or memoirs, or my resume, because you got to sit down and pick out the highlights of things that happen in your life, and then you craft it for like, oh, I'm applying for this kind of job, so I need to highlight these things about my life.
Right.
So I feel like we have that filter. It's just, can you turn that into a book length project that other people are going to want to read?
And you have to ask yourself, why do they want to read it?
So did Charles Williams write a biography or autobiography?
He wrote an early piece, which I can't remember the title of, which is very dark, about, is there any meaning? Am I just imposing meaning on life? Interestingly, Chesterton had a real dark phase. When he was in art school, he said, Impressionism is like, there is no reality. There's only your take on reality, your brush strokes and subjectivism. He says that very quickly Impressionism turns into illusionism, which is nothing is real except for my consciousness.
Yeah.
He flirted with solipsism for a while, which I don't believe in anything other than my own mind.
Yeah.
And suddenly he saw his arms and legs moving, and he said, "Well, that's encouraging. There's something part of my body that seems to be related to the external world."
Yeah.
Does he talk about that in his autobiography?
He does, yeah.
Interesting.
He talks about how this real dark phase in art school. And it is a funny thing where he never learned to be a painter or a drawer, but somebody hired him to start writing art reviews. And he said, here I was. I never learned how to draw or to paint, but I was writing critiques of Rubens and Tintoretto, and I discovered it was the easiest job in the world, and I've stayed with it my entire life.
Just criticizing other people.
Yeah, exactly. I can't do it, but let me critique how you did it.
Yeah. What about MacDonald? Did he write any autobiography?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
well, his novels are very autobiographical.
Yes.
Some of his Scottish novels, he has a scene where his grandmother doesn't approve of music, and he has this beautiful fiddle that he's gotten, and his grandmother smashes the fiddle. And so there's a lot of details in his fiction which are autobiographical, which is learning to love life as it is rather than imposing this forbidding theology upon life or this life-denying theology. As I said earlier, all autobiography contains some fiction, and all fiction contains some autobiography.
Yeah.
So I think all 7 of our authors, one way or another, you get to know their personal lives better through their writings.
Yes.
Some of them have very explicit reasons for writing, like Surprised by Joy, I want to help you overcome your obstacles to faith.
Yeah.
Others, like Chesterton's, are pretty much, he sneaks in these observations, but the overall thing is, here's my life, here's who I've met, here's who I knew. He also talks about where he got ideas for his novels. He was walking around in the suburbs of London, and he lived in Kensington, and his editor lived in Clapham Junction.
Mm-hmm.
And he started an article saying, there's a volcano brewing under Clapham, by which he meant there's a lot of unrest in the London suburbs. His editor changed it to, there's a volcano brewing under Kensington. He said, well, why'd you change that? He says, well, I live in Clapham Junction. I don't want to hear about a volcano. Make it your suburb. And he kind of got the idea for Napoleon of Notting Hill from this kind of patriotism of, let's talk about your suburb. Let's not talk about my suburb.
Interesting.
That happens around here in the Chicagoland. People say, did you hear about that murder over in somewhere? And I go, no, this is Glen Ellen. That didn't happen here.
Yeah.
That was in Lombard. Who knows what goes on in Lombard? But it's very interesting because he does give you little insights into why he wrote Man Who Was Thursday, Napoleon of Notting Hill, a lot of his other famous things.
So I have a question for you guys, and then maybe we kind of wrap up and summarize what we talked about. So one of my questions is, I feel like you're right that in a lot of the novels of our authors and novelists in general, especially fiction, there is an element of autobiography that creeps in, whether they want to or not. Sometimes it's more intentional. So, Sayers has spent all this time writing these autobiographies, or Chesterton, and those stories find their way into your novel in a fictional way, like you mentioned about MacDonald. But there is a danger and there is a tendency among English teachers, of which you are both English teachers, which is to say not everything in this story is autobiographical.
Right.
So where is that line? How do you find that? What are the benefits of reading an actual biography? Should we treat fiction books as autobiographies? Where's that line, and how can understanding autobiography help us as we think about novelists and novels in general?
That is the danger. That goes back to Sayers' first warning. And ironically, one of the biographies that was written about Sayers draws heavily on this second fragment, which is of fiction. And so he just assumes she is just making up characters, but there's almost a one-on-one correspondence. And sometimes it is an exact duplication of what she had in her actual autobiographical fragment. But if the author, him or herself, presents it as a fiction, I think it can be very dangerous to extrapolate from that.
Gotcha.
And what Sayers would say is that you know the worker by the integrity of their work. So you pay attention to the work itself, the structure of the work, what the work is saying,
let the work
rather
stand for
than
itself.
Use it as, ooh, I wonder if this meant that she stuck rocks up people's noses, and just
who was the Sauron in Tolkien's life?
Right, exactly. Where people just want to allegorize things.
Yeah, they treat it like like fiction is an allegory that gives us insight into the author's life. Yeah.
Well, people want to possess a text. They want to say,
that's a good way
I
to
don't
put it.
understand this, or it's free floating. You decide what it means. They want to pin it down and say, this is what it means.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would tend to, there's a continuum from the factual to Lewis says, I was influenced by Chesterton, so why would he lie? So let's assume the influence.
Yeah.
There's the speculative. When you read Magician's Nephew, you go, well, Diggory's mother is dying of cancer, and so was Lewis's, and he wants to find a way to go to Narnia to heal her. And it's pretty easy to see the connection between his own life story and the stories he's writing.
Yeah.
There's what's the word beyond speculative? Conjectural.
Hypothetical, maybe.
Hypothetical. People say, well, Lewis lost his mother, so in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, the witch says, come to my palace between two hills. And the two hills are breast because he wants to get back to his lost mother.
Did someone actually say that?
Yeah, there's a book, which I won't name the book because I don't want to give it any credence. But the idea, when you start out with an ideology and you try to fit their life or their writings into an ideology,
gotcha,
you're likely to make some pretty bad interpretive mistakes.
Gotcha.
Right.
So I think that's the spectrum.
Okay. So just, exercise caution when doing those things. To me, it's, I try to assume that it's not unless I have a reason to think so. Because, you'll read the Ransom trilogy, but then you read something in Suppressed by Joy and you go, oh, okay, maybe he was influenced, or that's, he was thinking this. But, I shouldn't draw conclusions about who the Harassa is in Lewis's life,
Right.
I totally agree. I think unless you can pin it down from their letters or their own writings, you shouldn't assume. There's a new theory that the Ketterleys, the Andrew Ketterley, the magician in Magician's Nephew, is based on a guy that Lewis didn't like called Martin Ketley, which is one of the people in Abolition of Man that he's critiquing. But I kind of go, oh no, that's kind of a leap.
Yeah.
So in general, I think, especially with Lewis, he's very obliging to people when they ask him about his sources.
Yeah.
So unless you can find some documentation, I would hold your own interpretive schemes rather loosely.
Yeah. But there are some broad themes that you can see standing out. Like you mentioned the Atlantis one, Atlantis shows up in that hideous strength. And it doesn't mean that it always has that meaning, but the idea that there's something, Atlantis holds some sort of importance or significance or sensuct in his mind.
Yeah, I agree.
The fact that it shows up in different novels tells you something, that it's in there, it's in Lewis's brain, and it's significant to him. Doesn't mean that every time he says the word, it means my mom. You know what I mean?
Right. Well, I think the rule of thumb is if we discussed it on this podcast, it's probably valid. If other people make that speculation, be suspicious. I think this is a rule of thumb we've all agreed on here.
Well, I would like to finish this podcast by suggesting something that I picked up from Sayers, and that there is one perfect autobiography, because in her chapter on autobiography, she writes that God wrote his own autobiography in Jesus Christ.
Oh, wow.
God revealed God's self in the human, Jesus.
The Wade Center podcast is a production of the Marion E. Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Our hosts are the co-directors of the Wade Center, Drs. Crystal and David C. Downing. Our episodes are produced and edited by Aaron M. Hill. If you enjoy the podcast and the content we offer, please leave us a review on iTunes, tell your friends, and consider making a donation to the Wade. The Wade Center is entirely self-funded. Financial gifts help support the expert services, vast collections, and varied programming we offer at no cost. If you have questions about the podcast or suggestions for future episodes, please email us at wade@wheaton.edu or contact us via Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. To learn more about the Wade Center, our 7 British Christian authors, what we offer, and how to make a donation, visit our website at wheaton.edu/Wade.